Everybody, what if I told you that Brook, yes, Brook from One Piece, could be somewhat based off the first superhero? I'm not talking about Batman, who debuted in 1939, who is also very thematically funny considering who we're about to talk about. But anyway, nor am I talking about Superman, who debuted a year prior. I'm talking about Golden Bat. Golden Bat is a Japanese superhero and often described as the world's first superhero who appeared in a form of Japanese street theater called Kamishiba. And excuse my pronunciation, but that translates to paper play. And this was during the time of the Great Depression in the early 1930s. What Kamishiba was just storytelling on the street. So this form of art predates both manga and anime, but it's also considered the precursor to manga and anime. But talking more about Golden Bat, his name comes from a popular brand of Japanese cigarettes that are also called Golden Bat that appeared in 1906. So, with that being said, Golden Bat himself is a golden skull-headed superhero that's often been described to be dressed as a swashbuckler, in which he has a high collar and a cape. But what's also so interesting about him is that he has super strength, invulnerability, flight, and fought with a rapier, which is quite odd considering he's from Japan. But the rapier itself looks somewhat like a cane in most depictions, which I also find quite interesting. But he supposedly is from Atlantis. But with that being said, he is a man displaced out of time, as he is from 10,000 years ago and was displaced in the 20th century. In the anime that shows up in 1967, it shows that he is being resurrected from a sarcophagus. So either way, he comes from the past to protect the future. Now, what's also quite interesting about him is that he supposedly has a fortress in the Japanese Alps, a fortress of solitude, you could say, which is interesting. But with that being said, too, in the anime, it's very funny that whenever he's confronting the machinations of his arch enemy, Dark Bat, also known as Dr. Eric Nazo, he seems to let out this very creepy laugh. And that's all the sound that ever comes from him. He just laughs at things, which is also quite interesting. Now let's compare One Piece to Golden Bat. Now, before we start comparing Golden Bat to Brook, however, we need to talk about another reanimated skeleton in the franchise. That being the first reanimated skeleton to appear in the franchise, called Captain Joke. Captain Joke was the antagonist of the first One Piece special called One Piece Special Adventure in the Ocean's Navel. Now, what's so weird about this special is that this was made during a time in which I don't think specials really adhere to the canon of the series because things were so early on. Because the things that happen in this special have no bearing on what One Piece is today or how movies and specials are treated today when it comes to One Piece. But in this special, we see that there is a pirate captain leading a crew. They enter this weird island that's actually in a basin, which is called the Ocean's Navel. And they go to this mountain and enter this mountain chamber, of which is guarded with a sealed gate. After breaking down the gate, they approach a stairwell which contains a fountain with a glowing light within it. So I guess that's the treasure, the secret of the Ocean's Navel. They are approaching the fountain, but then Captain Joke's crew mutiny against him and literally stab him in the back, killing him. However, that leads us into the events of the modern day, in which Luffy and the crew are out fishing and happen across a treasure chest with a skull in it. Said skull has an incantation of the Ocean's Navel inscribed on the back of it. Usopp takes the skull and the crew eventually find themselves in this same weird oceans basin that leads to an island. Events transpire, and they come across a giant octopus and a bat. Said bat is actually Captain Joke. The weird part about this bat is that it's an actual talking bat with an earring, which is quite odd at this point because there are no talking animals in the series. However, due to the events going forward, they defeat 3 sea monsters that were guarding the ocean's naval secret: a giant octopus, a sea urchin, and a lobster. So we have a full seafood boil here. After each one of them are defeated, their defeats reconstitute the skeleton of Captain Joke, mostly just making his limbs appear. However, when the body of Captain Joke is reconstituted, by that I mean the skeleton, the talking bat seemingly just disappears. And once Nami and Usopp make their way towards the same chamber that Captain Joke died in seeking the treasure of the ocean's navel, which is in this fountain, Captain Joke gets up, pulls out his multi-barreled blicky, and shoots Nami and Usopp in the back. This results in Usopp dropping the skull that he had in his bag, which belongs to Captain Joke. And once Captain Joke puts his skull back on his neck, his beard reforms. So this leads to Usopp, Nami, Luffy, and a village boy defeating Captain Joke by stabbing him in the head, and then the skeleton just dissipates into dust. Now, with that being said, we never find out what the treasure of the ocean's navel actually is, but this special is quite weird because none of this would ever fly today because none of what happens has any actual explanation. Why did Captain Joke survive being killed by his crew to come back as a skeleton and a bat? We don't know. Why were his limbs tied to the defeats of these weird ocean guardian guys? We don't know. So it's a whole bunch of mysterious stuff, but I do think this was the framework to set up Brook in the future. But like a bat, you should fly into that subscribe button and turn it gray, and then flop over and fly into the like button and click it as well. And using your echolocation, please locate the hype button if you can find it and click it as well. Thank you so much. It's very much appreciated. But continuing, even though Captain Joke is a bit nonsensical in the modern day, I do think he laid the groundwork for what Brook will become in the future. Even though technically Brook does predate Captain Joke because we've seen preliminary sketches of a skeleton being on the crew very early on. However, I do think Captain Joke was very important in setting up what Brook would become because he does have a lot in common with Golden Bat. Seeing as how Golden Bat is always characterized by bats, especially in the intro of the 1967 anime and in the first episode when Golden Bat is resurrected. This is funny because, of course, Joke is a bat before he reconstitutes himself and becomes a skeleton. This trickles down into One Piece proper because Brook is a skeleton thanks to his circumstances in being revived by the revive fruit. But the person who has stolen something from him, in this case his shadow, has the power to technically become a bat as well, as Moria, using the power of the shadow fruit, can turn his own shadow called Doppelman into a swarm of bats called brick bats. But with that being said, it's quite funny that both Golden Bat, Joke, and Brook are stuck in a location and need to be revived in some way. Of course, Golden Bat in the anime needed to be resurrected. Joke needed to be reconstituted. And Brook needed to be revived twice because Brook's soul needed to find his body, which had decomposed. But then after reviving, he lost his shadow to Gecko Moria. So in order to actually leave the area of the Florian Triangle, he needed to be reconstituted again in a way by getting his shadow back. So I find that very funny that the theme of reviving and reconstituting seems to be consistent throughout our three skeleton bros here. But what's interesting about these three skeleton bros as well is that all three of them have distinct laughs and laugh often. All Golden Bat does is laugh. Joke laughs constantly throughout the special, which I think is a pun within itself. And of course, Brook has a very distinct laugh. Following this, Golden Bat, like I mentioned before, is a swordsman and uses a rapier that looks like a cane. Brook is actually a cane sword user, and he performs various fencing techniques with his cane sword. However, the spin to this is that in Thriller Bark, when Brook's shadow is stolen and put into the dead body of a legendary samurai named Ryuma, once that dead body is reanimated by Brook's shadow and he's performing all of Brook's fencing techniques, those techniques come out way stronger. And it is mentioned that they come out like a gun blast. I think this is a reference back to Joke, because Joke was a gunslinger that used a multi-barreled revolver to fight. So this trickles back into Brook because during the post-time skip, when he was fighting in Punk Hazard, he too now has the power to thrust, and that thrust comes out like a gun blast. So I think Joke started it off, and it trickled down to Ryuma, which then trickled down back into Brook. Following this, it's quite interesting that all the powers of Golden Bat do find their way into Brook, sort of. Brook, like Golden Bat, does have a degree of invulnerability because things that will affect a normal person, like lightning, don't affect Brook in the same way. He's completely fine to be shocked by lightning. However, Golden Bat has super strength. Brook, I would say, does develop a certain degree of super strength as the series goes on. However, Brook, unlike Golden Bat, cannot fly. Golden Bat has the power of flight. Brook does not. However, Brook does have unique movement options that only he can do in One Piece, such as running on water or performing high jumps because of his body being so light. With that being said, happy Halloween, everybody. I hope you have enjoyed my One Piece Halloween special. With that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Watsu.